All right, we're ready for Proverbs 13 and 14. And I'm going to forego going through the details of our review of 1 to 9. We're not going to review each time, particularly chapters 10 on, because they're much the same thing, either miscellaneous or various principles or contrast from chapter 10 till we get about chapter 30. But the first 9 chapters lays down this principle that is summarized in chapter 9 of the invitation of wisdom personified as this woman and folly personified as a woman inviting us to their feast. And which one are we going to go to? So we're ready for chapter 13 in our study this morning. And it is in this section of various proverbs, just miscellaneous proverbs dealing with various principles. So let's get underway looking at Proverbs 13. As we've mentioned each time, and I mention again, and don't apologize for that the principle generally from chapter 10 to about 29 or 30, 29, we're going to have this miscellaneous proverbs. There'll be sections where there's a thought grouped together in a group of verses, but for the most part, you just have miscellaneous thoughts, and we're going to pick those out and group them together. And as we did in our last 2 or 3 chapters, we're going to do that here. So let's start with this, and then we'll come back to our questions here in just a little bit. Let's go ahead and get question 2. Let's get question 2 for today. What do we learn from 13:1 and 13:24 about the parent-child relationship? All right, say again a little louder. Yes. The simple or the naive child will not listen to the parent's instruction. What else? All right. Learning respect. Anything else? Yeah. Absolutely. Things we didn't understand, we got it. Good point. We'll say more about that in a moment. Let's get underway. The first category I've listed here has to do with listening to instructions versus refusing. So we don't have time to give detailed comments about every verse. We're going to pick and choose. We'll try to hit every verse, but some of them we'll camp on a little more and others we won't. Let's start with verse 1. This will fit into more than one category. The wise son heeds the father's instruction, but a scoffer does not listen to rebuke. Interesting, the contrast that he makes, the wise versus the scoffer. In other words, the scoffer perhaps thinks he's wise or wiser than his parents or others. And so he scoffs and he ridicules. He doesn't think much of the instruction. But a wise son listens to his father. He doesn't scoff at that. Verse 10, drop down to verse 10. By pride comes contention, but with the well-advised is wisdom. What do you get particularly from part B of that verse? Or grouping, let's just take the whole verse.
The first part, whenever we're excessively focused on ourselves, we're discontent and breed strife.
Absolutely. All right, good point. You think there's a connection between pride and being well-advised or a contrast? Yeah. Yeah, it resists that. So pride is not only a cause of strife, but it keeps us from listening. I am as smart as you are, maybe smarter, so that I'm not interested in what you have to say. I'm smarter than my parents. I don't need what they say. They don't know. They don't understand. So pride gets in the way. Get verse 13. He who despises the word will be destroyed, but the one who fears the commands will be rewarded. I'm learning from that knowing the will of God and respecting the will of God is entirely two different things. And so you can know the will of God, but respecting it, having fearing the command of God, having respect for the command of God. One of our biggest problems in the world and in the church is a lack of respect for the word. We know what it says. Respecting it is something else. All right, let's get one more verse on that. Verse 18. Poverty and shame will come to him that disdains correction, but he who regards reproof will be honored. When you hear reproof or rebuke, do you have disdain for it? Or do you respect that? The one who respects it, verse 18 said, brings honor to himself. All right, questions or comments on that category of verses? All right, let's look at 1 and 14. We had a question about that. We've already looked at verse 1. So here's what I'm learning about the parent-child relationship. The child should listen, and a wise child will listen to the parents. It is not a sign of wisdom of how smart you are when you rebel to the parents' parental instruction. Drop down to verse 24. We haven't talked about that yet. What do you learn from verse 24? Right. The one that spares the rod, in other words, doesn't discipline. By the way, all through the book of Proverbs, the word rod simply means switch or branch. Look up the word, and it means a branch or a switch. It's a spanking, that's what it's talking about. Contrary to popular concept, spank the child. But the one that spares that actually doesn't love the child, but they hate the child. You say, well, I don't hate my child. Hate in the Bible almost always means lack of love. Very seldom does it mean despisal. I'm not saying it doesn't, but almost always it's used in the context. Look at the context. It means a lack of love. In other words, if you spare the rod, you don't really love the child like you should. You love them, but you don't love them as much as you should. You're not showing love. But the parent that loves the child disciplines him, the New King James says, promptly. What does that mean? Don't delay. Early, the footnote will say. In other words, it needs to be dealt with now versus waiting, and you wait, you're going to pay a price for that. And so, just as a footnote, we're going to see several Proverbs throughout, and we already have seen some. We're going to see several Proverbs about parental discipline. When my children were small, I tried to seek every information I could and bought books on rearing children, like James Dobson and others, but several books. The most help that I came across anywhere, hands down, was the book of Proverbs. That helped me more than any book. Any kind of advice, any parental instruction, anything that I got from anybody, reading the book of Proverbs helped me more as a parent. Keep that in mind if you are a parent of a young child. All right, let's go to another category here, and let's see what we've got. Let's talk about the tongue, verse 2. Now this one's quite interesting because of the strange wording of this. A man shall eat well by the fruit of his mouth, but the soul of the unfaithful feeds on violence. What do you think?
Wise and good speech brings forth blessing.
Say again?
Wise and good speech brings forth blessing.
Yeah. I think there's a couple of things in mind, and I think this is part of what's being emphasized, is that the tongue can be a tool for good. The tongue can also be a tool for evil. How do you use your tongue? But the idea that he eats well, some have suggested it means that he eats well because this is what he has an appetite for. If you eat a lot of something, you probably have an appetite for it. I doubt you're eating a lot of peanut butter if you can't stand the taste of peanut butter. Why do you eat a lot of it? Because you have an appetite for that. So here's something that you don't eat a lot of. In fact, you hardly ever eat it at all. Probably you don't have an appetite for that. And so in that light, a man eats well of the fruit of his mouth, and the unfaithful feeds on violence. Why does a man feed on violence? Because he has an appetite for that. Does that make sense? All right, verse 3, along the same line. This one is one you'll want to remember and underline. He that guards his mouth preserves his life, but he opens wide his lips shall have destruction. What's that mean?
Shall be judged by what you say.
All right, you'll be judged by what you say. Yeah, you don't have to say everything you think. You don't have to tell everything you know. Some people think, if I thought it, I need to reveal it. If I know it, I need to tell it. You don't have to tell everything you know. You don't have to tell everything you think. Think before you act. Think before you speak. And the one who opens wide his mouth is susceptible to destruction. Verse 5. A righteous man hates lying, and the wicked man is loathsome. Let me reword. I misread that. But a wicked man is loathsome and comes to shame. The idea of being loathsome, it calls him distinct because he hates dishonesty. He's going to treat other people fairly is one of the things I learned from that. All right, let's move on to another category. Let's talk about righteousness versus wickedness. This is always a large category in every one of the Proverbs. So we won't notice, some of these are already we've covered, so we're not going to cover every one. Righteousness, we've already covered verse 5. Let's look at verse 6. Righteousness keeps him whose way is blameless, but wickedness overthrows the sinner. Pretty simple. Righteousness is rewarded, and wickedness is also rewarded. Skip verse 9. Let's go to verse 15. Verse 15. Now this one's interesting. A good understanding gains favor, but the way of the unfaithful is hard. What does that mean?
The way of the unfaithful here is the consequences of life and living.
All right. Let's start with the first part of the verse. Goodness, doing good, doing right, gains favor or gives favor. Goodness begets goodwill, I think is the idea, that a good person does good things. But the way of the transgressor is hard. The way of the transgressor is rough. I think it focuses on consequence. The one who goes astray is on a rough course. You do good, you're on a good course. You do evil, you do bad, you're on a bad course. There are consequences. The way of the transgressor is hard. For example, the drunkard now has destroyed his liver. The way of the transgressor is hard. There's consequences to sin. The man that gambles has lost everything and he's in poverty. The way of the transgressor is hard. There's consequences to sin. Make sense? The adulterer is now living single because he's lost his family. The way of the transgressor is hard. Consequences to sin. Make sense? All right. Let's go further. Verse 17. A wicked messenger falls into trouble, but a faithful ambassador brings health. What do you make of that? What's it saying?
That lie comes back around.
All right, yeah. Lies come back around. The wicked messenger falls into trouble. We're just going to, he's a wicked messenger and it comes back to bite him. Faithful ambassador brings health. One who faithfully fulfills their charge, whatever that charge may be, responsibility, versus one who does not. We'll come back to verse 19 later in another category. Let's go to verse 22. A good man, now this one's interesting. A good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children, but the wealth of the sinner is stored up for the righteous. I'm interested particularly in the first part of the verse. It can go one or two directions, and so commentators have gone in various directions on this. What do you think it means?
If you train your kids right, they will grow up and they will train their children right. So you passing knowledge and wisdom down to the generations. So your children's inheritance will be the knowledge that you taught your children, and so on and so on.
Good point. Good point. Some commentators have taken it because of the expression at verse 22, but the wealth of the sinner, in contrast to the inheritance, that it's only talking about material things. And maybe so. King kind of takes it in that direction. And that's worthy of considering. But and so in that light, it's saying that a righteous person who follows the principles of wisdom will have an inheritance to leave to his children, in contrast to the verse 22, the wealth of the sinner is probably going to be distributed back to someone and end up in the hands of those who are wise, those who are righteous. But I take it more to the influence. It might involve the inheritance, but it has to do with the righteous influence goes to more than one generation. And when you when you take a righteous life and you're living a righteous life, you're going to influence your children, but you're also influencing your grandchildren and maybe your great-grandchildren. You're going to leave a good name, good reputation, good principles. So if you're old enough that you have grandchildren and maybe great-grandchildren that are living righteous, that's probably largely to your living right prior to that. Does that make sense? Good principle to follow. All right, let's forego verse 25 for the moment. Contrast between the righteous versus the wicked. Let's go to the next category, work versus laziness. This is going to be a reoccurring, not in every chapter, but in a number of these chapters, we're going to see this reoccurring time and again. Look at verse 4. The soul of the sluggard desires and has nothing, but the soul of the diligent shall be made rich. What is that saying? All right. Soul of the sluggard desires much. He'd like to have money. He'd like to have the house. He'd like to have the car. He'd like to have clothes. He'd like to have what everybody else has, but he's too lazy to get going and get it done. And he thinks that John Doe over here, everything he touches turns to gold, and he fails to realize John Doe has worked himself to death to get that. I've heard that among people. Boy, he's lucky. He sure is lucky. He's got things that I wished I had, and yet he's working himself to death, and yet this guy over here is just lazy. Make sense? Let's go to verse 23. Deals with the same kind of subject. Now this one is a little different in that it words, much food is in the fallow ground of the poor, and for lack of judgment there is waste. What is that talking about?
The fallow is uncultivated, where it's almost like the money's there, but he just won't go do what's necessary to bring forth the harvest.
That's part of the difficulty of this verse, is that some take it, and that may be correct. I'm not going to say that's not. That there's much food in the fallow ground of the poor. That he could have more than what he has, that he's lazy. Others suggest that it's saying that the poor with industrious work can have much food. He has what he needs. Even though you're poor, but for lack of justice there is waste. Your footnote on the waste means it's swept away. So King and others suggest that maybe it has the idea that it's ripped away by injustice. That you may be in poverty, you don't have a lot, but by hard work you can have what you need. You have plenty of food. You take the fallow ground, you work it, you till it, and you've got what you need. And yet injustice, people who are ungodly can sweep it away from you. It may be government, it may be neighbors, it may be whatever. I'll leave that. You can pursue. Harkrider takes one view, King takes another. You might pursue those and see which one of those you line up with. But this is a reoccurring theme throughout Proverbs. Yes, sir.
There's also, in a poor man works hard, yet he doesn't have anything either. But he is trying his best to feed his family and everything too. There's exceptions that all the rules.
Interesting point. Very good. I want us to start with verse 7 on this point, rich versus poor. This is a contrast all throughout. But what's interesting about verse 7, I've got it underlined as one of the key verses I want to remember. There's one who makes himself rich and yet has nothing, and one who makes himself poor and yet has great riches. Now this is another one of the verses where commentators go in different directions. But I think the one that makes more sense to me, did we have a question on this one? I don't think we did. The one that makes more sense to me is this, and that is, it has to do with pretension. Hang on. There is one who makes himself rich and yet has nothing. What that means, I think, is there are those who pretend to be rich. They talk like they're rich. They act like they've got money, but they don't have anything. Have you ever been around someone who's talking about what they're going to buy and what they're going to do, and I'm about to buy this piece of land over here, and I'm going to buy another truck, I'm going to buy another car, and you think, if I remember right, you don't hardly have any money. But he's talking about what all he's going to do. He acts like he's got money. There's one who makes himself rich and yet has nothing. And yet there's one who makes himself poor and yet has riches. Have you ever been around someone who talks about they're wondering if they can afford something? They not only could buy anything in the store, they could buy the store. But they're wondering how they're going to make it. I'm not sure how I'm going to make it. I don't know if I can afford this. And they can afford that. And what I'm learning from verse 7 is this principle. If you are in poverty, don't act like you have money. And if you have money, act like God blessed you. That doesn't mean you brag about your money, but don't act like you can't hardly make it. How would you feel if I handed you $500,000 and I gave it to you? Or let me just reverse that. You gave me $500,000. And I have that money in my account. And you said, I want you to use that and spend it. And every time I turn around, I act like I can't afford anything. How would that make you feel? How would that make you feel, Stephen? You just gave me $500,000 and I need a lawnmower. My lawnmower's wore out. And I said, I'm not sure I can afford this $1,000 for this mower. How you feel?
Greedy, maybe hypocrite.
And I'm looking for another word. Unappreciative. I'm unappreciative. You just gave me $500,000 and I act like I can't afford anything. What are you thinking about your money? It means nothing to me. That's what, if God's blessed me, I need to act like God's blessed me. I don't mean I brag about what I have, but I don't need to act like I'm in poverty. Does that make sense? There's a principle there. Well, that would almost preach, wouldn't it? Look at verse 8. No, I want to skip verse 8. Let's go to verse 11, talks about riches that are gained by dishonesty. That's pretty simple. Down to verse 23, we've already talked about much food is in the fallow ground. And so the poor can have what they want. I particularly wanted to focus on verse 7 on that one. Questions or comments on the rich versus the poor?
You should use your money, but not to use your money to the point that makes advantage for you. Makes your life easier. Instead of just flaunting it away if you gave me $500.
Yeah, exactly.
Feel good on that either side.
Right.
Just flaunting it away, it wouldn't mean nothing to you. Like he's not taking care of what you gave him.
Right. Not a good steward. Not a good steward. Good point. Very good point. Talk about wisdom versus foolishness. 3 verses in a row that deal with that. The law of the wise is a fountain of life, and to turn away from it is a snare of death. In other words, listen to wisdom and it leads to life. And we've already talked about verse 15. And this one's interesting at verse 16. Every prudent man acts with knowledge, but the fool lays open his folly. I think that simply suggests wise people do wise things and foolishness is revealed. We've already talked about pride. Now this one is interesting about hope. Look at verse 12. Hope deferred makes the heart sick, but when desire comes, it is a tree of life. What do you make of that?
With all our hope, and for instance, one thing here on this earth, all our hope is in material possession, whatever it is. We don't get that. Put forth great effort, and that has not come through, and our hope will be just crushed.
Yeah. Yes, you're exactly right. This is a general principle. It could be talking about something material. It could be talking about something you're hoping to accomplish. It could be a job you're looking for. It could be a relationship you're hoping to establish. Hope deferred makes the heart sick. Where you were hoping and you were disappointed because it didn't come about. You missed the job. You didn't get the job. You didn't get the money you thought you were supposed to get. The promise that someone made wasn't fulfilled. And so your heart's sick. But when it finally comes, whenever that may be, it's a tree of life. Look at verse 19. A desire accomplished is sweet to the soul. Same principle of this hope that we have. I think it's saying essentially the same. An abundance of fools departs from, it is an abomination for a fool to depart from evil. Say more about verse 19 perhaps another time. Look at verse 20. This talks about companions. Let's get this one and we're ready to move on. He that walks with wise men will be wise, and the companion of fools will be destroyed. What do you learn from that about companions? Makes a difference who your friends are. You run with the wise, you're apt to be more wise. How could that be?
How you're influenced by your friends and your surroundings. A little bit of leaven's the whole lump.
Oh, yeah.
If your friends have evil intents, evil thoughts, you being associated with them means that you don't detest it. So it means you're tolerating it.
Right.
It means that there's an opportunity there for Satan to sneak in on you and grab a hold of you.
Good point. The principle applies to being with those that do evil versus those who do righteous. But even let's just brush that off to the side. Even they're not doing anything evil, but people that use wisdom versus people that make foolish decisions. You spend your time around people that make foolish decisions, then you're going to end up doing some of the same things. You're going to be influenced by that. You spend time around people that make wise decisions. Maybe let's just take money, for example, which is a subject here. Or maybe the tongue. They say things that they shouldn't say. I don't mean cursing. I just mean they reveal secrets they shouldn't. And you begin to think along the same line. Or maybe they spend money they don't need to spend, and you start spending money you don't need to spend. You're influenced by people you're around, is what I learned. All right. The clock is running, so let's go to chapter 14 now. And so again, we have in chapter 14 a contrast between wisdom and foolishness. Several verses here. We're not going to notice every one, but we'll start with verse 1. And it also is going to be in a category a little bit later on the home. Every wise woman builds her house, but the foolish pulls it down with her hands. What does that mean?
You make improvements in your life when you're wise. You build your house, making it a better place. Foolishness makes it worse.
Absolutely. Here's the wise woman is working for the welfare of her family versus the woman who professes love for her family, but she's negligent and idle. She helps build the family, the estate, and doesn't waste what's there. We'll skip verse 3. Let's drop down to verse 12. Yeah, there's a way that seems right, but the end's there for the ways of death. If you don't have that one marked, that one needs to be remembered. That's going to be repeated again in chapter 16. That one's pretty obvious what that means. Verse 15, the simple believe every word, meaning the foolish people are easily deceived, I think is the idea. The person lacking wisdom is easily deceived, but the prudent considers well his steps. The wise are very cautious about what they believe and what they do, what they say. Wise people are always cautious, but the prudent believe every word. They just do whatever and believe anything. I'll come back to verse 17. Let's get verse 24. The crown of the wise is their riches, but the foolishness of fools is folly. I think means we benefit from our work, we benefit from our efforts, but the foolishness of fools that they don't benefit from, or they do benefit from their efforts, but it's not a good benefit. In interest of time, I want to drop down to I want to come back to the tongue. I want us to look at back to verse 3. In the mouth of the fool is a rod of pride, but the lips of the wise preserve them. What do you learn from that?
A fool can say things that eventually come back on him and hurt him, but a wise man just keeps them to himself.
Yeah. Wise man's always careful with what he says. Very careful. He chooses his words carefully. The fool doesn't do that, and they bring on themselves what is due to pride. Now, I'm interested in dropping down to verse 7. Go from the presence of a foolish man when you do not perceive in him the lips of knowledge. Now, put this in the category of tongue, though it's in the category of also should have been up there with wisdom and foolishness. What's it saying? Spend some time around a person and they start talking in a way that, I'm not saying they're using bad language, I'm just saying they're showing that they are very foolish. Why? Who said that back here? That's Caleb. Okay. Yeah. You can't benefit, you can't gain anything from them, and you're going to be influenced, as we saw in the previous chapter, by that foolishness. Go from the presence of him, he's pouring out foolishness. Look at verse 23. In all labor there is profit, but idle chatter leads only to poverty. In other words, you're better off when it comes to trying to make a living, to get busy, get to work instead of standing around talking. And idle chatter doesn't produce any good thing. All right, let's move on from let's talk about the home again. Verse 1 we've already considered. Verse 11, the house of the wicked will be overthrown, but the tent of the upright will flourish. Just a brief comment that verse 11 is just simply saying that righteousness produces a better home than ungodliness. Look at verse 26. Now, this one's interesting. In the fear of the Lord there is strong confidence, and his children will have a place of refuge. By the way, the term fear is used more in Proverbs in these 2 chapters than we've seen so far, for what that means to you. What do you learn from verse 26?
Kind of tie that back to verse 11, where the upright's tent, it's going to stand like a firm structure, even though it's a tent, because it's a righteous man.
Yeah. Good point. Good point. If you are the parents and you have children in your home and you have the fear of God in your home, and you're leading your family with the fear of God, your children have a safe refuge to go to. They have a place to go. I don't mean a literal shelter. That may provide literal shelter, but they always know where to go, and they have a safe refuge because under that banner is the fear of God. Does that make sense? You're under the banner of the fear of God. We're going to do whatever the fear of God tells us to do. And so when problems come, let's go back to the fear of God. When the storm comes, we're going to run under the fear of God. And that's a strong refuge. Work and effort found at verse 4. Now this one's quite interesting. Where the oxen are, where no oxen are, the trough is clean, but much increase comes from the strength of an ox. This principle is going to be repeated again, not by the ox, but it'll say something about an axe a little bit later in one of the Proverbs. We haven't come to that yet. We'll save that. Yeah, there's a good and bad comes with this.
Without the oxen, you're not going to have that large harvest, but then you don't have that.
That's right. So you've got a field and you'd like to make a crop and make some money from that. Make an income, or at least have plenty for your big family, whatever. But if you don't have oxen, you don't have to clean up after them. You don't have to feed them. The troughs are clean. The stalls are clean. There's no work, but then you're not producing much. But if you get the oxen out, or you buy some oxen and you plow your fields and you're working that, now you got to feed them and clean up after them. So the point of that is that wisdom says you're better off to use ox rather than a hoe making your crop. But there's going to be some inconvenience and there's going to be some work that goes with that. Make sense? You're going to be productive. You got to spend money to make money. You got to spend some time to make money. Have some inconvenience to make money. So, yeah, I'd like to make the money this guy's making, but I don't want to go through all the trouble. Well, that's part of how he made his money. It's all the trouble he went through. Make sense? I want to make a crop, but I don't want to fool with tractors and the fuel and well, you ain't going to make a crop. It ain't going to happen. All right, make sense? All right, let's go to seeking wisdom, verse 6. A scoffer seeks wisdom but doesn't find it. What does that mean?
They're pursuing it where it can't be found.
Going in the wrong place, yeah.
I thought they're going to people, they're going to tell them what they want to hear.
Yeah. So and he fools himself because he thinks he's looking for wisdom, doesn't he? I want to do the right thing, so I'm going to my friends and asking, but I'm going to the people that's going to tell me what I want to hear. So the scoffer seeks wisdom, but he doesn't find it. But knowledge is easy for those who understand. Wise people will find that wisdom. We'll forego verse 8. Righteousness versus wicked. May come back to that if time permits. Let's go to verse 12. Again, our own thinking. There's a way that seems right to man, but the ends are there for the ways of death. What does that mean? Might make a margin of note 16 and 25.
And man to direct his own path is like a similar verse in the Bible. Where the next man thinks he knows the right way, but he doesn't know the right way.
Always took caution when you hear someone say, I think, I feel, I believe.
Yeah.
Open the eyes on that.
Yeah. Focus is on self. I want to back up to verse 9. Verse 9 in this category here. Fools mock at sin. Your footnote will say guilt. But among the upright there is favor. Fools mock at guilt. How do fools mock at sin or guilt? Maybe a number of ways. I'm not looking for any one particular. No big deal. You telling me I'm guilty of sin? So what? Yeah. You telling me I'm going to lose my soul? Big deal. Yeah, they mock at sin. Oh. Yeah, the danger is that's for somebody else. That doesn't apply to me. Good. Say again? They are deceiving themselves. Now, verse 13 we need to talk about. Verse 13, even in laughter the heart may sorrow, at the end of mirth may be grief. What on earth is that saying?
They look at you on the outside, on the inside.
All right. Yeah. Even in laughter the heart may be sorrow. Yeah. I was looking for another verse that went with this. Verse 13 should have appeared, verse 10 should have appeared in that. That's what I was looking for. Even in laughter, the heart may sorrow, and in the end, may be grief. In other words, some of the people that seem to be the happiest people and laughing all the time, that inside they may be full of sorrow. Does that make sense? Some of the most successful comedians had the most miserable lives. Committed suicide, but they were funny as they could be. They're laughing all the time. Verse 10 goes with that. The heart knows its own bitterness, and the stranger does not share its joy. And here's what I'm learning. I'm going to paraphrase what I think that means. And some of you are trying to copy this, and we're about to run out of time. And that's not should be reworded. I've changed that outline, and I meant to send that in, and it didn't make it. But anyway, instead of busybodies down at verse 10, it has to do with this principle of dealing with sorrow. And that is, the heart knows its own bitterness. In other words, I know what I'm going through. You know what you're going through, and none of us really understand what all the other one is dealing with. Does that make sense? And it's partly true when I may say to you or you say to me, I know what you're dealing with. I don't know all you're dealing with. I understand what you're going through. That's only partly true. Because the heart knows its own sorrow. No one knows where, one writer said, no one knows where the shoe pinches except the person wearing the shoe. So, well, I know what you're going. No, you don't. You're not wearing the shoe. You don't know where it pinches. You don't know what I'm going through. I don't know what you're going through. I understand you're going through difficulties, but I don't understand it fully. And so let's be careful is what I'm learning from that. Let's talk about control of spirit. And then I want to talk about one more verse, and our time is gone. Look at verse 29. Verse 29. He that is slow to wrath has great understanding, but he is impulsive, exalts folly. What does that mean? Yeah, you're slow to wrath. You're a person of great understanding and wisdom. The one that explodes and is impulsive is foolish. Let's get one more verse. One more verse. Let's get verse, what verse did I want? Verse 20. I put it in the category of the rich versus poor. But verse 20, a poor man is hated even by his own neighbors, but the rich has many friends. That last phrase is what I wanted to focus on. If you think you have no friends at all, if you think you don't have anybody that cares about you, you let the word out that you've got a lot of money, and your friends are going to come out of the woodwork. You're going to find friends you never thought you had. I want to tell this one story and we're done. I had lunch with the Musselman brothers. They ran a big printing plant that printed Sports Illustrated, and they printed one of the songbooks we used to use. They printed Searching the Scriptures, Truth Magazine, big printing firm. They also own 2 factories. And they said, we started out poor. We pulled all this business up by the bootstraps, and said, we did not know we had friends until we became successful, and now we've got friends everywhere with their hands out. Proverb is correct. Proverbs 15 and 16 next time.